Universal basic income, it's one of the most important social and economic concepts that we can talk about right now. But what are the arguments against it? Let's take a look. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Attic. On this channel we are talking about the whole range of philosophical issues, and in this series of videos we're discussing universal basic income. In the previous video I went through arguments in favour of universal basic income. In this video we're going to focus on the arguments against it, and then by the end we can evaluate, do we actually want universal basic income or not? Is it motivated on philosophical and economic grounds? If you're finding these videos useful and interesting, consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the bell icon to get more updates about videos in this series. I'm going to talk you through three main arguments, okay? So we've got the affordability issue, but I've already said we're going to treat that as a separate thing. So here I'm going to look at an argument from Desert, basically saying people don't deserve a universal basic income, so don't give it to them. An argument from state interference, the state shouldn't interfere. And thirdly, an argument that the money could be spent in better ways. Okay, I don't think the first two are going to be good arguments, but that third one can be quite powerful. Okay, so let's begin with this argument from Desert. So I think this is something you hear quite a lot, but it's rarely put in terms of an argument. It's usually just asserted, but I've tried to reformulate it as a proper argument so we can assess it in the way that we philosophers love to do. So we might set it out as a series of premises and conclusions like this. Premise 1, if somebody hasn't earned something, then they don't deserve to have that thing. Premise 2, if someone doesn't deserve to have that thing, then the state shouldn't be giving it to them. The state shouldn't enable them to have that thing. Third premise, people don't earn universal basic income. Conclusion, so the state shouldn't be giving people a universal basic income. Is that a good argument? Well, it's a deductively valid argument. Two instances of modus ponens on these premises and this premise give us the conclusion. So basically we want to know, are the premises any good? Let's go through them one at a time, and let's just do it in reverse order. Premise 3, yeah, that seems obviously true. People don't literally earn universal basic income. It's something that they are given by the government. Now, you might quibble with this one because it depends on what you mean by earning it. You might say that people earn it in virtue of being a citizen, okay? But I think that's a bit of a quibble in the sense that people don't go out to work for it. You don't have to do anything to get your universal basic income other than by being a citizen. I think we can pass this premise that people don't earn universal basic income. Premise 2. If someone doesn't deserve something, the state shouldn't provide it to them. There are some potential counterexamples to this premise. So, for instance, Nottingham might well soon go into lockdown. I don't think Nottingham deserves to go into lockdown. Like, it's not like it's done something super bad such that lockdown would be a suitable punishment. Nevertheless, you might argue it that the government should be putting Nottingham into lockdown for the benefit of the people in Nottingham, okay? So I think there are some cases where you should do something, the state should do something for people's benefit, for their health, for their good, that they don't deserve. But I think in the sense in which it's intended, if we're talking about a benefit rather than something like a lockdown, an imposition, then I think premise 2 looks reasonably secure. I think the problem with this argument is going to be premise 1. If someone hasn't earned something, then they don't deserve it. And here, to make this premise tie in with the third premise, we're talking about a sense of earning where you actually have to go out and do something positive in order to count as earning something. So is it the case that if you don't go out and do something and earn something, then you don't deserve it? No, I just think that's not true at all. So think about citizenship, for instance. You qualify for citizenship in a number of ways, but one of them is just by being born in the country, okay? You don't have to do anything to earn it, to deserve it. In general, think about the concept of human rights. We have these in virtue of being human. You don't have to go around do anything to earn or deserve those rights. And in fact, desert is just the wrong concept to talk about human rights, okay? If you want to bring desert in, basically you just have to say, I deserve my human rights in virtue of being a human. Premise 1 here is really, really dodgy, so we're just not going to accept this desert-based argument at all. Argument 2 against universal basic income, the idea that state interference is an inherently bad thing and universal basic income is state interference, so we should just avoid it. I've put interference here in kind of scare quotes because what for one person is state interference, for another would be state support. Okay, so if you think about social security, is it state interference in people's lives or is it supporting people in their lives? So this is an argument that people on the political and economic right love to push, but I don't think any of them actually believe it as a philosophical argument, not in all its instances, right? So if it's a general principle that the state shouldn't interfere in our lives, if you're a landowner, but I think, well, you shouldn't be entitled to that, so I come and occupy your house, your land, you're probably going to want to call the police and have me removed. Well, that's the state interfering in my life, but you're going to support that. If you invent something and you copyright it or you patent it and try and make money out of it, and then I steal your idea and try and make money out of it, and you're probably going to want the law to intervene and tell me to stop doing that, okay? Well, that's state interference in my life. It's a limit on my freedom. You know, I don't have the freedom to steal your ideas and make money out of them. So pretty much everyone, but particularly those on the right, are going to want state interference in those issues. So anyone proposing this argument is going to want to sort of say, well, state interference in some cases is fine, but it's not fine in other cases. Okay, but then we're just back to where we started with, you know, is state interference in people's lives, in the issues of like economic security that you'd get with basic income, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And we have to discuss those issues on their merits, not as a basic principle about state interference. There's an additional problem with this kind of state interference argument, which is provided by the people on the right, the economic right, who support universal basic income. And that's the idea that you can have economic support, so big economic state, without state interference through universal basic incomes, precisely through universal basic income, basically by giving people a big pot of money and saying, do whatever you want with it, okay? That is economic support, but without interference in the sense of telling people what to spend it on. And actually, you know, I'm very far from the economic right, but I think that is a very important principle. The idea that when you give people basic income or state benefits or whatever, it's up to people how they spend that money. It's not for the state to say, okay, if you're going to get benefits, you've got to spend it on food rather than things you really want to spend it on. We're seeing these discussions quite a lot at the moment, actually, with the issue of hungry school kids. Should the government spend a small amount of money to feed these hungry kids in the holidays? And, you know, you see some people say things like, oh, well, these parents, if they can afford a phone, why can't they afford to spend money on kids? I mean, these are just terrible, terrible philosophical arguments if you think about them. And one reason they're terrible is, well, it's really not up for the state to tell people what they should spend their money on. Third argument against universal basic income. And this is an argument that I actually think does have some weight behind it. It's the argument that the money that would be spent by the state in providing people with a universal basic income could be better spent in other ways, particularly in helping people to improve their lives. Think about a movement like the effective altruism movement. So the idea that we look at various different ways of charitable spending around the world, and we try to work out which is most effective in saving people's lives and improving the quality of people's lives. So, for instance, I think there's research that shows that a small amount of money spent on malaria nets in developing countries can really improve the quality of those people's lives. It can save a huge number of lives, and it's really, really cheap to make and distribute these nets. So there's a strong consequentialist argument there that if you've got some money to spend, you should be donating that money to malaria programs in developing countries. Okay, you're going to save large numbers of lives. You're going to increase the quality of a large number of people's lives. And on consequentialist grounds, that is just a thing that you are obliged to do. So if a government is going to be spending a large amount of money, it shouldn't be doing it on universal basic income, raising the quality of people's lives in the UK, because amongst other things, we have a high cost of living here. In order to improve people's lives, it takes a large amount of money. We should be taking that money and spending a large proportion of it on, for instance, malaria nets in the developing world. So if you're not a consequentialist, you might not accept the argument, but I think there's pretty strong reasons to be a consequentialist, and I think you can also accept it if you're not a consequentialist. So let's think about the argument in its own terms. What assumptions does it make? One assumption it makes is there's more or less a fixed amount of money available to spend, and then the question is, do we spend it here on universal basic income, or do we spend it there in the developing world on malaria nets? When I get on to talking about the issue of affordability, we'll see that that's not a true premise. Okay, that's a mistaken assumption. There isn't a fixed amount of money that we can spend on one or the other. So because it's not a choice between this or that, I don't think this argument straightforwardly goes through. Another complication with this argument is actually the consequences, particularly the economic and the social consequences, are really hard to calculate. So if you spend money on reducing social inequality, that can have a lot of positive effects through the kind of social feedback loops. It's very hard to balance up those effects against very straightforward effects like saving people's lives in the developing world. It's just not a straightforward matter of balancing up those consequences. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be spending money on, for instance, malaria programs in the developing world. Given how cheap they are and given how effective they are, we definitely should. I'm just saying that this argument against universal basic income doesn't straightforwardly go through. Okay, so let's just sum up this section, okay? We've had 5 arguments in favour of universal basic income, arguments from discrimination, from poverty, insecurity and inequality, from freedom, from economic arguments and from social justice. Which of them work? The discrimination argument is really strong in its own terms, but I don't think it quite gets us to the conclusion that we should definitely have a universal basic income. It basically needs to combine with other arguments, other benefits in order to do that. Arguments from poverty, insecurity and inequality, these are really strong. I think these in their own right do get us to the conclusion in favour of universal basic income. The freedom argument, I don't think the right-wing version really works. I think the left-wing version is very powerful. The economic arguments, prima facie there's a strong economic argument for universal basic income. The argument from social justice, again, I think that's a really powerful one, but there are some philosophical assumptions there. Arguments against universal basic income. Well, I talked very briefly about the argument from desert, the argument from state interference, and the argument that money could be better spent. The first two, I think, are really awful arguments, dead in the water. The argument that money could be better spent elsewhere is powerful, but I think there's a mistaken assumption there, and that is the assumption about the affordability of universal basic income. So summing all of that up, on balance, yeah, I think there is a really powerful, strong philosophical argument in favour of universal basic income, and it's supported by arguments from the social sciences and economic arguments. So there's a very strong case to be made in favour of universal basic income. But then we have to ask, is it something we can afford? So we now have to move on to the big elephant in the room, the affordability issue. Can we afford a universal basic income? And that's going to be the topic of the next video. Okay guys, so that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the comments and support. I will see you back next time.